Hello everyone and welcome to today's video. Today we're doing our updated bracket video where you have the final 8 contestants now, 4 Democrats and 4 Republicans facing off. We're going to go through the video, through the matchups, assign who I think would be the winner of those matchups, and then we'll go a recap of the video and who will be left for the final 4. So with that said, let's get into the first matchup. We have, starting with the Republicans, we have the number 1 versus number 5 seed matchup. We have Vice President J.D. Vance taking on Trump administration official RFK Jr., Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Now, this is an interesting matchup as these are two both very prominent MAGA Republicans. And as this slide will show you here, that the polling right now shows J.D. Vance with a very strong lead. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., despite not necessarily being a Republican on paper, RFK Jr. is still one of the most prominent figures in the MAGA wing in the Trump world of Republican politics right now with his Make America Healthy Again initiative. So RFK Jr. does certainly have a good amount of support at 3.6% starting out, right around there with Vivek Ramaswamy and Nikki Haley. Now, he did, when he was running for president as an independent beforehand, had a decent amount of support before he ultimately endorsed Donald Trump. So that's why Kennedy, as the 5 seed, was able to upset Nikki Haley as the 4 seed in the last video. In terms of this matchup, though, Kennedy's going to have a really tough time against the current vice president, who is sitting at 43.2% in the race to the White House polling average. J.D. Vance has long been thought of as the presumptive 2028 Republican nominee if he does decide to run, and in this matchup, not really too much is going to change that. Now, I also want to show off this slide as well, as this shows, using the Decision Desk HQ website, 2 of their polling features. And one is the national polling data, which shows President Trump's approval rating currently at 41.6% approve and 55.6% disapprove. Now, obviously, from a polling standpoint, President Trump is down roughly about 14 points. For the Republicans and for Donald Trump, that's not good news. You certainly don't want to be down that much as a president, especially going into a midterm election year, let alone talking about a next presidential year for your vice president. But when it comes to Republicans, President Trump's approval rating, though it's gone down a little bit, is still very, very strong at 80.4% approve, 17.2% disapprove. So even though Democrats and a good majority of independents in the country don't like the job President Trump is doing, Republicans really seem to enjoy the job he's doing. And when it comes to talking about President Trump's handpicked vice president, one of the first major decisions he made in his second term, in his run for office for a second term, was picking J.D. Vance to be his vice president. That is certainly very significant, given the fact that most Republicans like the job that Trump is doing. As for the polling trend line for J.D. Vance as well, it's fluctuated a little bit here and there between the upper 40s and the lower 40s, but he's been remaining pretty consistently as the Republican frontrunner, really going back to about November and December, where he was sitting around 25%, and then he skyrocketed up to around 30, 33%, back down to 30, then up to above 40%, and Vance has never really gone too far down after that. The only difference here in the polling is really at the beginning of the cycle of July 1st, around 2024. This is when J.D. Vance was just picked as the vice presidential nominee for Donald Trump, and his odds almost immediately surged up. Ron DeSantis almost immediately surged down, and Vance has remained a frontrunner ever since. Donald Trump Jr., the president's eldest son, who is a close friend of J.D. Vance, still holds considerable amount of support at 14.3%, though Trump Jr. has already gone on record saying he would not run in 2028, and he would definitely not run against J.D. Vance, who is a very close friend of his. If J.D. Vance decided not to run for whatever reason, then I think Donald Trump Jr.'s name could come back into it, but I've omitted Trump Jr. from this video because I don't believe he's running as long as Vance is, and Vance holds a very clear commanding lead over this field. As for RFK Jr., his numbers have remained relatively consistent. They started putting him in around December 20th, and I believe it was for 2024, 2025. And in terms of where things stand for him, not really changed too much. He's hovered right around 5 to 10% or so and hasn't really gone too much different from that. As for the polling yet in each state, this is a new feature for this video that we're not in the prior to. This is the early polling on the race to the White House polling averages of the early primary states. And the Republican primary, the early states, you have the Iowa caucus being the first caucus state, New Hampshire, the first primary state. Then I believe it goes to South Carolina, then to Nevada. And all the polls that have been done thus far, we certainly have a long ways to go. A lot of these states only have 1 or 2 polls in each. I think New Hampshire's leading the way right now with 4 polls in that state. JD Vance is currently leading in every single polling average that's been taken thus far, so obviously he has a early lead or commanding lead on the polling as well for the early primary. So as for this matchup for JD Vance versus Robert F. Kennedy Jr., not really too surprised. You can tell I've been leaning this way throughout the whole video. JD Vance, I think, would win this primary matchup of Vance versus Kennedy, and there would be a good amount, I think, of independents that support RFK Jr. that maybe will switch over to the Republicans or pull a Republican ballot to vote in the Republican primary for RFK, so it may make things a little bit more competitive. But JD Vance, being Trump's handpicked vice president, has a large amount of support among Republican voters, and if Trump made an endorsement in this race for JD Vance and this head-to-head primary matchup, I think Vance essentially would lock up all the support. Obviously, in real life, if Vance does run, there's more likely than not going to be more than one Republican running against him, and that may change percentages and such. But in the head-to-head, I think Vance would beat RFK Jr. rather handedly in advance to the next round. Next, we have the number 2 versus number 3 seed. On the Republican side, we have Secretary of State Marco Rubio taking on Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, or as I nicknamed this one in the last video, we had the MAGA Bowl. Now in this one, we have the Florida Bowl, or the Battle of Florida. And Marco Rubio, now being Trump's Secretary of State, has gotten a certain bump in his notoriety among Republicans, and certainly among the MAGA wing of the Republican Party, which it certainly has a large control over the party right now. Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, still remains one of the most popular, well-known Republican governors in the country among Republican voters, though his run for president in 2024 against Donald Trump certainly hurt him with a lot of popularity among the most dedicated, diehard Trump Republicans. Had he not run in 2024, he probably would be polling in second place, maybe even first, with JD Vance as the handpicked Republican to succeed Trump, but now Marco Rubio has an advantage in this regard. As for the polling at this current point in time, taking Trump Jr. out of this equation, Rubio polls in second at 14.1% in the race to the White House average. Ron DeSantis is right behind him in third at 7.8%. So in the polling level, Rubio and DeSantis are the 2 and 3 for this race. Now it makes sense why Rubio and DeSantis are both here. Rubio obviously getting a lot of national attention as Trump's Secretary of State and the media weekly. Ron DeSantis still being one of the most well-known Republican governors in the country in the state of Florida gives him a lot of notoriety and polling bump as well. It will be interesting to see what happens with DeSantis as his term is up in 2026, so he'll be out of the public eye from 2026 and 2028. We'll see if he's still talked about, if his support goes up or down in that time period. Though Rubio at 14.1% has seen a little bit of a polling surge in the last 6 months or so as Trump has talked about him more publicly in the media. Rubio has certainly seen a very big polling bump. He was right around the 3 to 4% range that Haley and RFK Jr. was last year before he really started being talked about more. Back to the polling trend line for this, you can actually kind of see this here. Rubio is this navy blue color, and you could see that back around August 1st, he was polling right around 1% or so in the polling, not really too strong. Right around June 1st, his numbers peaked right around 10% or so. His numbers fluctuated in between around 7 to 8%. Now he went back up, and now he's gone up to his highest mark here at 14.1%. Ron DeSantis, however, has had a little bit of a inverse here, where he started out roughly back in 2024, July 1st of 2024, around 28%, and he has gone down since then with Vance becoming the vice president, and his numbers have remained relatively consistent around the 10% range, going up or down a few points here and there, currently averaging out around 7.8%. So there's still a good amount of Republicans. 7.8% is still probably a few thousand, tens of thousands of Republicans that like Ron DeSantis, but his numbers are roughly cut in half of what Marco Rubio currently has at this current time. As for the early polling, I showed you the map that shows JD Vance leading in every single state at the presidential level, but there's some interesting findings among the state's polls so far. For instance, the state of New Hampshire, JD Vance is 45.3%, but Marco Rubio has surged up to 20.6%. Most recent polls from St. Anselm College, UNH, and Emerson have shown Marco Rubio rising in the polls to being the clear second place finisher to JD Vance right now. Ron DeSantis, who once upon a time was a challenger to Donald Trump in 2024 in these polls, only right around 4.7%. So in a poll that includes Rubio and DeSantis, Rubio has a lot more support locked up in the early primary state, the first primary state of the state of New Hampshire. As for the polling trend line itself for New Hampshire, it gives a little bit more perspective here. JD Vance has actually gone down roughly about 5 points to even more, to 10 points from where he was before. Where you see Marco Rubio's here, his numbers have really skyrocketed. Right around March 20th, he was polling right around 5%. He's now up to 20.6. DeSantis starting out a little bit above here, right around 6%, now down to 4.7. So Rubio certainly has been the one to gain, consolidating all the support in the Granite State. So as for Rubio versus DeSantis, I do think this would be a competitive matchup. But again, I think the Republican Party right now, as well, or as long as Donald Trump is president, is the MAGA Republican Party, is the MAGA wing of the party. And being President Trump's Secretary of State, I think gives Rubio a lot of notoriety. I'm sure, even though they've made amends, I'm sure President Trump would endorse Marco Rubio. Some consider him to be his handpicked successor right around J.D. Vance. Over Ron DeSantis, the Florida governor, was his one-time opponent in 2024. And with that said, I think Marco Rubio would get the win in this Republican primary. I know another favorite winning, but I really do believe in this primary between Rubio and DeSantis. I do think Marco Rubio would defeat Ron DeSantis, doing very well in the early states of Iowa and New Hampshire, and then that would set him up very well. I also think Rubio would beat DeSantis in the state of Florida and ultimately probably wrap the primary up there. So Rubio wins and advances to the next round. Next, we have on the Democrat side, the number 2 versus number 3 seed, Gavin Newsom, the governor of California, and Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, and Joe Biden, presidential administrative officials, the Secretary of Transportation, and 2020 presidential candidate. This honestly might be one of my favorite matchups of the entire tournament. Between Newsom and Buttigieg, it's going to be a complete toss-up on who wins this one. The early polling right now, Gavin Newsom in the national lead is at 19%. He is in second place behind Kamala Harris. Pete Buttigieg is behind him at 10.6% in third place. So there's roughly about a 9-point lead at the national level for Newsom versus Buttigieg. Now, when you go into the state level on the map, though, it's almost an exact even split in the early polls for where Buttigieg and Newsom is winning. Buttigieg currently has a lead in 4 of the early states: New Hampshire, North Carolina, Florida, and Texas. Newsom's currently leading in roughly about 5 states of Alaska, his home state of California, Nevada, Ohio, and Maine. So in the early polls thus far, both Buttigieg and Newsom are really sort of like planting their flag and starting to get off to an early lead in these early states. As for the state of New Hampshire, I showed on the Republican side where things stood with Vance and Rubio. In New Hampshire, Pete Buttigieg, a state he did very well in Iowa and New Hampshire in 2020. He's off to an early lead in this one once again, polling at 23.5%. Gavin Newsom's at 13.7%, so a 10-point lead for Buttigieg over Newsom there. And this is obviously very significant as New Hampshire, the Democratic schedule is not the same as the Republicans now. They still have to ratify the plan for 2020 for the Democrats, but expect New Hampshire will probably be going somewhere either at the top or very close to the top in the Democratic primary, and New Hampshire going to Buttigieg would be very significant. Now, we did see in 2020 Buttigieg, I believe, either tie or win Iowa over Bernie Sanders, and then very similarly, I believe he either tied or almost won New Hampshire as well. So in terms of can Gavin Newsom win without winning Iowa and New Hampshire, yes, but he would have to have a big win in South Carolina and then do very well in his home state of California, which would probably be expected. California, the early polling shows Gavin Newsom at 28.5%, Pete Buttigieg in third place at 11.3%. This is where the primary would get very interesting, is I would expect Buttigieg to do very well in Iowa, in New Hampshire, in places like that, and then we see Gavin Newsom do very well in South Carolina, in California, and in states with a lot of more black voters in the Democratic primary, like Georgia, like Ohio, like Pennsylvania, even though Buttigieg and Newsom will be really battling Pennsylvania for who to win that state, it becomes like a back and forth battle of a very close Democratic primary. As for the state of Nevada, obviously neighboring to California, Newsom has a commanding lead over Buttigieg here, 37 to roughly 18.9%. So another state that shows in the early numbers, Newsom having a lead outside of Iowa and New Hampshire. So for this matchup, I think Newsom versus Buttigieg truly would be a very, very close Democratic primary, one where the first week or so of the primary, I think Buttigieg would be off to a very strong start. And then once Super Tuesday hits, I think you'd see Gavin Newsom then slowly starting to pick up support, pick up delegates, pick up votes, where I think Gavin Newsom ultimately prevails as the winner in the primary. I think Buttigieg would do well in the states with a lot of the whiter populations, like Iowa, like New Hampshire, like a Vermont, like a Maine, like really New England, but then throughout the country, like the places with a higher Black African-American turnout, I think we see Gavin Newsom pick up a lot of delegates there, a lot of votes there, and ultimately gives him the edge in a very narrow primary win. So Gavin Newsom wins and advances into the Final Four. Now we have the number 1 versus number 4 matchup, Kamala Harris versus Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, I said that Newsom versus Buttigieg was one of my favorite matchups of the tournament. This one may actually be my favorite matchup of this entire tournament, because you have the former Vice President, Kamala Harris, who some are predicting to be the favorite, obviously number 1 seed in the bracket here, to be the Democratic nominee in 2028, after she was the Democratic candidate in 2024 against Donald Trump and was the Vice President under Joe Biden. Versus Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the number 4 seed, someone who is only a U.S. representative compared to the Vice President here, but she is someone with a massive national following among Democratic primary circles. And we saw what happened in 2025 with Zohran Mamdani and a lot of younger Democrats getting out to vote against the establishment candidate Andrew Cuomo. Now, Kamala Harris does not have the unpopularity issues that Andrew Cuomo has, but still a lot of young Democrats and independents got out to vote for the more farther left candidate, and that represents AOC in this matchup. Now, for the Democratic polling on this one nationally, Kamala Harris is the narrow favorite right now. She's at 24% in first place. Newsom and Buttigieg are in second and third, as I mentioned. AOC is in fourth place at 8.4%. So nationally, Kamala Harris has a large early lead over Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. Now, at this current point in time, and I've seen some comments in the comment section below reflecting this as well, we're in 2026. 2028 really doesn't start going until 2027, right after the midterms, and when things start to get moving there. So at this point, the polls really are reflecting the candidate that most Democratic voters like and that they've most heard of. The former Vice President and Democratic nominee in 2024, Kamala Harris, is likely leading right now due to the fact that she is the candidate that everyone has heard of. So I do think it's possible her numbers do diminish a little bit as things move on. In the early polls in the primary states thus far, we've actually seen that trend a little bit more than on the national level, where Kamala Harris is still leading in most of the polls. As I showed the map before, with Newsom and Buttigieg leading in most of the states, AOC is leading in the state of Vermont. Kamala Harris currently, even though there are a lot of states that don't have any polls conducted yet, Kamala Harris has not led in any of the states thus far. And we can look at a state like New Hampshire, which I showed earlier. Buttigieg is in first place, Gavin Newsom's in second place. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is actually in third place at 11.5. Kamala Harris is down in fifth place, even below Mark Kelly at 7.6%. So if New Hampshire is at or near the top of the list, Kamala Harris finishing outside of the top 3 would be a very bad sign for her in a presidential primary, and a lot of support may consolidate to AOC in a head-to-head matchup of AOC versus Kamala Harris. Now again, are you going to overreact to one poll 2 years out from a primary? Sure, no, but it's very significant that in a state like New Hampshire, AOC is already off to an early lead. In the state of California, the home state of Kamala Harris, Gavin Newsom obviously is leading at 28.5% as the governor of the state, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is in second place at 13.5%. Pete Buttigieg is in third at 11.3%. Kamala Harris at 10.2%. She's in fourth place in her own home state in the early polling thus far. Now, again, a long ways to go. These numbers can certainly change as we get closer, but the early sign of her being at 10.2% in fourth place is certainly not very good. Now, without Gavin Newsom in the race, does she consolidate a lot of that support and overtake AOC? It's her home state, so she probably does, but it's interesting at this point that she's currently not leading. Next, we have the state of Nevada. Not as much of a difference here. Newsom's leading by a lot. Buttigieg is in second at 19 points, but AOC is at 8.9. Kamala Harris is at 6. So in 3 of the early states thus far in this multi-candidate race, AOC is ahead of Kamala Harris. In a head-to-head matchup, it's possible Harris jumps over AOC in a lot of these states. But again, when you talk about Democratic primary, Bernie Sanders did very well in 2016 and 2020 in getting a lot of younger Democratic voters out to vote. And they were in multi-candidate races and primaries. In a head-to-head matchup, it could be similar to New York with Zohran Mamdani, where the establishment candidate would be Kamala Harris, the farther left young Democratic candidate would be AOC, and which candidate are people more motivated to get out and vote for. So this is why the complaint of this video has been that there haven't been a lot of the favorites winning, or a lot of the favorites going down the bracket. It's been too predictable. What if I told you the plan the whole time was for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the number 4 seed, to knock off Kamala Harris, the number 1 seed? Because I honestly do believe Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, if she runs for president in 2024, is going to be someone that starts out, say, heading into the first Democratic primary debate, polling somewhere in 3rd to 4th place, and after that first debate is really going to catch fire among Democratic primary voters and become one of the front runners. And I think we're going to see Kamala Harris's support honestly go the way that her first presidential run in 2020 did. She'll come into the debate with a decent amount of support, but then after the debate, her numbers will slowly start diminishing. And then maybe by the time the first state, whether it's Iowa or New Hampshire or South Carolina or California, Nevada, whichever state they give it to, we may see Harris's support start to diminish. And then ultimately things, we'll have to wait and see how they play out. But I think Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in this matchup versus Kamala Harris is poised for an upset due to the fact that she has the momentum in this race. Harris's numbers, I think, are only going to go down as more of the Democratic candidates become well known. And I think AOC kind of shocks everybody, wins against Kamala Harris, and advances to the next round. So with that said, the final 4 bracket challenge is now set. With the 1 seed Kamala Harris getting knocked off, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is now the number 4 seed. She'll be facing off in the final 4 against Gavin Newsom, the number 2 seed, who defeated Pete Buttigieg on the Democratic side to be the Democratic candidate for president in 2028. On the Republican side, J.D. Vance, the number 1 seed, defeats the number 5 seed RFK Jr. as expected to advance to the final to go up against his fellow Trump administration official Marco Rubio, the number 2 seed, who defeated Florida Governor Ron DeSantis to go into the final 4. So one of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Gavin Newsom, J.D. Vance, or Marco Rubio will be my 2028 presidential March Madness bracket early prediction for the 2028 next president of the United States. I hope you've enjoyed this video. Make sure to leave a like and comment section down below what you think of this video. Stay tuned as we're going to have the final 4 video coming out in just a few days. You're going to want to stay tuned for that one. Until then, thank you so much for watching and hope to see you in a future video.